Please join me for a word of prayer. In the words of Marion Wright Edelman, "O God, we thank you for this day of life, for eyes to see the sky, for ears to hear the birds, for feet to walk amidst the trees, for hands to pick flowers from the earth, for a sense of smell to breathe in the sweet perfumes of nature, for a mind to think about and appreciate the magic of everyday miracles, for your spirit to swell in joy in our spirit at your mighty presence everywhere. Now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God, our rock and our salvation." Amen. In the 96th Psalm, the appointed psalm for today, we hear these words: "Sing to the Lord a new song, sing to the Lord all the whole earth. Sing to the Lord and bless God's name." For God's salvation is from day to day. Declare God's glory among the nations and wonders among all peoples. For great is the Lord and greatly to be praised. God is feared more than all gods, and for all the gods of nations, they are but idols. But it is the Lord who made the heavens. Oh, the majesty and magnificence of God's presence. Oh, the power and the splendor of God's sanctuary. Ascribe to the Lord, you families of the peoples. Ascribe to the Lord honor and power. Ascribe to the Lord the honor due God's name. Bring offerings and come into God's courts. Worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. Let the whole earth tremble before God. Tell it out among the nations, the Lord is king. God has made the world so firm that it cannot be moved. God will judge the peoples with equity. Let the heavens rejoice and let the earth be glad. Let the sea thunder and all that is in it. Let the field be joyful and all that is therein. Then shall come all the trees of the wood about, shout for joy before the Lord when God comes to judge the earth. God will judge the world with righteousness and the peoples with God's truth. I couldn't have picked a better song. I didn't pick that song. Marilyn did. But if I would have been picking the song for this sermon, it would have been "How Great Thou Art." Because the psalmist certainly speaks to that. And so for a few minutes today, we want to reflect on a theme taken from the 3rd verse of that psalm: declare God's glory among the nations and God's wonders among all peoples. Declare God's glory. We're in the process of working on youth ministry with a team and with Marilyn and others, and there was a song that was very popular for many years at youth gatherings. I'm not sure if it's still sung, but it's "Our God is an awesome God. God reigns from heaven above with wisdom, power, and love. Our God is an awesome God." Those same words speak to the lessons for today. For one thing, our scriptures tell us in this time of confusion, this time of COVID-19, this time of dealing with white supremacists, systemic racism, in this time when looking for reform and how we live as a community, looking for equity, celebrating diversity, and working for full inclusion for every human being. To remember who it is that we worship. To remember who it is we center our lives in. Not a political ideology, not a person, not a thing. Well, I hope. But some people probably spend more time washing their car than they get on their knees and praying. But who is it that we worship? For us Christians, and so for other faith traditions, it's the God of all creation. Declare God's glory, we hear today. We think we are so smart in so many ways, and yes, God's given us wisdom and science and literature and all music, all kinds of things that make humanity more real. But even when we do something like send a rocket to the moon, we think that it's so great, but we forgot who created the moon. Who created the meteors, the stars, the planets? God is so much bigger than we can imagine. That's why we declare God's glory, because God, though, is personally engaged with us. We know that through the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. This is an important reminder for us in this day, because people are experiencing anxiety. I'm finding misplaced anger coming out from places when I think people just need to step back and remember who they are and whose they are, and then deal with that in a good way. Use that energy in constructive ways. A good friend of ours, Reverend John Ruder O'Hara, who's pastor of Prince of Life in Oregon City, wonderful pastor. If you get a chance to go out there and visit, or if you live out there, it's a great church to join. But John did a meditation for a group of us clergy in Oregon, and it's one based on gratitude. In fact, we're going to send the link to it out to all of you this week. Whenever there's something really good you want to share, I want to make sure you have that. But he starts with a very simple thing of getting up in the first 5 minutes of the day and spending 5 minutes writing 3 things he has gratitude, thanks to God for. Centers him totally differently. He ends the day that way too. But to begin the day with gratitude for God who created our very beings. For God, even in the craziness of the world we're living in right now with so much misinformation and distrust, God is the one we put our trust in. To lead us and guide us, help us to be compassionate and loving, to discern what is right and what is wrong, to lift up those who are broken and knocked down, to see that we judge nations upon how the most vulnerable are doing, not upon how the richest are doing. That is part of our calling as Christians. When we center ourselves each day in God's goodness, we can live into that. You know, God uses everybody. I have to remember that, because sometimes I don't understand what people do. From the lesson in Isaiah today, God is telling Cyrus, the king of another nation, God's going to use him. And God uses this other king to free the people of Israel who are in bondage. Wow, from unexpected places. God tells this king who did not know God that he's going to call him by name. And then God reminds this king who God is. And even this king straightens up. I am the Lord and there is no other, God tells him. I form the light and create darkness. I make weal and create woe. I, the Lord, do all these things. Oh, a lot of times in life we have to look for God's work in unexpected places. Places we never could have imagined where God is at work. Yes, let us declare God's glory each and every day. Paul, writing to the church in Thessalonian church. Whew, I've been to Thessalonica. Tamara and Brandon and I on our sabbatical back in 2009 to go to this city that is all ruins today. Once it had 80,000 people. Emperors came both directions to take it over. There were slaughters. But this church in Thessalonica, sprung up. And out of this least expected places, in some ways, great things were happening. And Paul lets them know they're declaring God's glory by the way they're living. He says, for the word of the Lord has sounded forth from you. Wow. What an affirmation for this church in an out-of-the-way place. When you walk through the ruins, I mean, you can walk down a hillside, and must have been an incredible city at one time. Big amphitheaters, but this little church of the early church was truly making a difference because they were declaring God's glory. God's glory. Jesus is on his way to the cross. And it hasn't happened. He has not been arrested yet, but he knows what's coming. But the leaders keep trying to trick him, because if he can say something against the emperor, That can show he's truly one that came to revolt. But he didn't come to revolt with power and might and violence. He came to bring a new day in the lives of human beings, to show who God is in their very presence, healing the sick, feeding the hungry, picking up those who've been broken down, bringing down the high and mighty into new relationships, breaking down barriers, not building them. And so some of the leaders try to trick him, because they know if he can say something against the emperor, he could be in trouble. So they ask him, whose face is on this denarius? You can just see Jesus taking that. I can imagine this moment of quiet. What's he going to say? What's he going to say with this coin? And what's he doing with this coin in his hand? And he says to them, whose face is on it? Whose imprint? They say, of course, it's Caesar's. Given to Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. You know, that verse has been so misconstrued in our society. I remember being downtown at First Unitarian several years ago. We had a ballot measure then to make sure undocumented sisters and brothers in the state could get driver's cards so they could drive, get their kids to the dentist, to school, to the doctor. Oh, but a whole group rose up against that. They thought it was the worst thing in the world. I'll never forget walking out of that church where with one of our governors speaking that day about the importance of people being able to get around. Those who work the land, those who do so many jobs others might not. I remember coming out, and I kept my robes on, and the agreement was we were not going to talk with protesters, but here were about 50 protesters outside that church. Oh, Reverend Knutson, you give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God. You shouldn't be talking. And they kept quoting that verse to me. I said, what's the great commandment? They couldn't quote it. Not to knock my sisters and brothers, but let us remember what Jesus was saying. Yeah, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, but you know what? Even that belongs to God. Nothing belongs to us. We are but stewards of God's creation. Nothing belongs. I don't care who you are. Caesar was putting his name on everything, saying it belonged to him. Even one ruler called the Sea of Galilee the Lake of Tiberias after themselves. Oh, the arrogance of human beings sometimes, but nothing belongs to us. And Jesus wanted to make that point. He made it clearly. It all belongs to God. But what else was he saying to them that day? Don't ever think the church does not belong in a public square. Jesus certainly was in a public place. In fact, his death on the cross was one of the greatest public executions of all time. His resurrection was not kept silent either. We belong in the public square talking about God's stewardship. To God be the glory, not to any of us. Jesus wanted them to remember the most important piece. Whose image is on us? Children, we talked about that earlier. Turn to your parents, and everybody here, turn to someone else and say, you're made in the image of God. And then say, aren't you beautiful, with your mask on? Aren't you beautiful? We're seeing a new type of beauty today with masks on everybody, but aren't you beautiful? You're made in the image of God. That's what Jesus wants us to hear again and again and again. And if we accept that, then we say, to God be the glory, because God has created the most beautiful human race. And for all the bad you hear, children, remember a whole lot of good's being done by human beings. Every day people are trying to help each other out. And you don't read about it in the news, but it's happening all around us. Because people who declare God's glory use every fiber of their being, imperfectly so often too, but we try every day to use every fiber we have to do God's work in the world of compassion, of healing, of hope, of love and peace, of justice and faith that can move mountains. Oh, let us declare God's glory. Let us start each day and end each night asking for forgiveness when sometimes anger does come through in us. Let's redirect that energy. Oh, declare God's glory by getting up each morning and having a meditation about gratitude. At lunchtime, take time to talk about things you have great gratitude to God for. At dinner time. Oh, each day may we declare God's glory by saying, to yourself, say, I know that after this election, I have to remember that everybody's made in God's image. And I need to reach out to people who are different, who I may have disagreed with. I mean, God sees something in each of us, so we got to look ourselves. Let's go deep. Let's remember you're made in God's image, and so every human being needs to be encountered with grace and love, but we have to debate sometimes. At the same time, we're still called to love each other profoundly. Let us declare God's glory by looking at this country we live in today and seeing every human being as God's image and say, God, thank you for putting us in one of the most fascinating lands in the world. We're one of the most diverse. If we can see our diversity as pure gift and work for equity for every human being to overcome systemic racism and COVID-19, if we do that, God will use us in ways we can't imagine. Yes, we give God the glory through our music, through our work, through our reading, through the art. We declare God's glory each and every day. As the psalmist said, as Marilyn sang, "Oh God, how great thou art," at the beginning of this time, and then we hear the words of the psalmist again. Sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord all the earth. Sing to the Lord and bless God's name. Proclaim the good news of God's salvation from day to day. Declare God's glory among the nation and God's wonders among all peoples. Amen and amen.